They entered the national park as hikers and simply stopped existing. No struggle, no trace, not even a footprint, as if the forest itself decided to keep them. These are not legends. These are real disappearances that defy explanation. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. I've hiked the Smoky Mountains more times than I can count. Their folds and ridges feel like old friends, predictable, steady, always there when I need them. That morning was supposed to be no different. My pack was light, the weather forecasted clear, and the trail I chose, one I'd walked dozens of times, was carved into my muscle memory. Yet, from the moment my boots crunched over the first stretch of gravel, something felt off. The forest was too still, as if holding its breath. Even the birdsong seemed to stop short, caught in some invisible snare. I glanced back after the first mile and froze. The trailhead, the wooden signpost I'd passed not 10 minutes before, was gone. In its place was nothing but an unbroken wall of trees. Not overgrown, not obscured, gone, like it had never existed. I laughed under my breath, chalking it up to disorientation, but unease coiled low in my stomach. I marked the location on my GPS, a habit I'd developed years ago, and pressed on. The screen pulsed back at me reassuringly, heading north, elevation steady. But every step deeper into that green labyrinth felt like stepping into someone else's dream. Halfway through the second hour, I noticed the markers. At first, just subtle signs, scratches on bark too evenly spaced to be natural, stones stacked in tidy little cairns along the path. They weren't there before. I was certain of it. I crouched to study one, the rocks damp and cold as if freshly placed. A shiver traced my spine despite the warmth of the day. Someone or something was ahead of me, or worse, behind me, my GPS chirped. I looked down and frowned. According to the device, I was moving in a perfect circle, looping back on myself. But the land around me was unfamiliar. Ancient oaks twisted like frozen dancers, moss carpeting the ground in patterns that almost looked like script. I restarted the device. Same result. A neat mocking loop. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. Pride, maybe. Or curiosity. The kind that swallows reason whole. As the canopy thickened, the light changed. It wasn't just dimmer. It was distorted, fractured into strange shafts that bent and shimmered as if filtered through water. The air grew heavy and metallic, and the silence deepened until I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. Somewhere behind me, a twig snapped. I spun around. Nothing but trees. Still, I could swear they'd shifted slightly closer. I pressed on, marking each turn with bright orange tape, only to find the strips gone minutes later. Once I carved an arrow into a tree trunk with my knife, a crude anchor in this unmoored landscape. An hour later, I stumbled past the same tree again, its bark smooth and whole, as if I'd never touched it. It was then, in the growing shadows of late afternoon, that the thought first surfaced, quiet and absurd, yet impossible to shake. What if the forest wasn't misguiding me by accident? What if it was reshaping itself around me, erasing exits, rewriting paths like a living thing defending its territory? And if that was true, what else might it be hiding deeper inside? I pushed deeper because turning back felt like walking into the same fear. The canopy drank the sun, the air cooled. The radio gave only static, so my breathing became a metronome. I chose the method I trusted: observe, hypothesize, test. If this was a maze, I would map it. If it lived, I would listen. I set a timer and planted a reflective stake each minute while I walked a straight line. 10 stakes, a right angle, 10 more, a crude grid across the ferns. It should have looked like graph paper. Instead, it sagged like a child's scrawl. Stakes I'd placed earlier leaned at new angles, as if the ground had exhaled. Then a faint vibration rose through my boots, a buried purr, fog-fingered between trunks, carrying a smell like wet copper. My headlamp carved a tunnel that caught motes drifting like confused snow. Ahead, water gabbled as if a creek were laughing. I followed, but the creek braided and unbraided, always just out of reach, like thread slipping a needle. My GPS showed a tidy loop. Was I moving, or was the hill turning? The first marker I didn't place was a ring of feathers around a stump. The second was a spiral of wet stones, a single red leaf at its center, wrong for the season. My rational mind offered foxes, pranksters, wind, yet the arrangements felt intentional the way handwriting feels intentional. I pictured missing hikers' families, photos taped to ranger walls like votive candles. Who arranged these and for whom? Night arrived without ceremony, a curtain falling when the stagehand is tired. My headlamp swung from trunk to trunk and seemed to swing back at me, tethered to its circle. I spoke to the trees to hear a human voice asking questions I couldn't answer. How far? Which way? How long? The forest replied with the hiss of needles and a hush that felt almost protective, a lullaby with a warning stitched inside. I tried one last test. I clipped my compass to a branch and turned slowly, watching each twitch of the needle. North wavered and settled where no star agreed. I marked it and walked. Minutes later, I stepped into my own boot prints on fresh leaves, tread beside tread, a mirror held to the ground. The understanding arrived quietly, like a blade slipping into water. The trail wasn't guiding me out. It was guiding me back to itself. I stood until the woods pressed in, my lamp haloing a room around my body. I thought of deer paths, ant colonies, networks that thrive by repeating patterns until nothing new survives. Maybe this place heals by erasing. Maybe it keeps secrets by folding them inward like hands in prayer. And if it keeps secrets, what am I now? A trespasser or a story it intends to finish? I killed the light. Darkness felt kind, and the thrum returned, patient and deep, a drum under the roots. I spoke my name and the names of the lost, as if introductions mattered. Silence answered, complete but not empty. In it, I sensed a choice. Fight a map that writes itself, or accept the room the forest made for me. Behind me, a small click sounded, like a latch finding home. Night settled. The trail kept me. I still remember the night he vanished, not as a blur of panic, but with every detail etched into my mind like a scar. His name was Daniel Cole, my partner on countless search and rescue missions across Yosemite. He was steady, unshakable, the kind of ranger who laughed at storms and treated the wilderness like an old friend. That's why I didn't worry when the call came in about a lost hiker near Tenaya Creek. It was just another night patrol, another rescue. We'd done this 100 times before, but that night, the forest was different. The sky hung low and bruised with storm clouds, though no rain ever fell. The pines were utterly still, not a whisper of wind passing through their needles. Even the usual chorus of crickets had gone silent, as if the forest itself were listening. Daniel noticed it too. "Feels wrong tonight," he said quietly, and I had no reply. We checked our radios, gear, and headlamps, then started into the dark. Our boots crunched over pine needles and damp soil, each step swallowed by the hush. 2 miles in, the signal from the missing hiker's phone pinged ahead. Routine procedure. I held the GPS. Daniel swept wide to check a ridge. Our radios crackled as we traded updates, static wrapping around our words. "Clear on my side," he said once. "Nothing yet," I replied. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Then his voice came through again, quieter this time. "Do you see that?" I asked what he meant. A pause, then a strange edge crept into his tone. Lights between the trees. I stopped walking. "Flares?" I asked. "Campfire?" But his next words sank cold into my gut. "They're moving." The transmission cut. I called his name, ordered him to check in, cycled through channels. Nothing but static hissed back. At first I told myself the ridge was blocking signal. He'd come back around in a minute. But 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20, and the only sound was the thundering of my heartbeat. I followed his path up the ridge. My flashlight swung wildly over trunks and underbrush. I found his footprints clearly in the soft soil, each one sharp and deep, until they stopped. One last boot print, the heel sunk halfway into the earth, and then nothing. No drag marks, no scuffle, no sign of struggle. As if Daniel had stepped into the air and vanished mid-stride, we launched a full search by dawn. Drones, dogs, volunteers combing every inch of the valley. Nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a piece of gear, not a body. The official report blamed a fall into an unseen ravine, but I hiked every crevice in that sector myself. There was no ravine. Locals had another theory. They whispered about forest lights, strange orbs that lure the lost away from the trail. Folklore, I thought, old ghost stories. But then I remembered Daniel's final transmission, that rising unease in his voice. and for the first time I began to wonder if we were searching for a man, or for something. And with every empty-handed day, the forest seemed to grow heavier, as if it were aware of what it was hiding. I traced and retraced the same routes until the ground felt etched into my bones, but the place where Daniel's boot prints stopped always remained the same. Abrupt, mocking, final. No broken branches, no displaced soil, just the echo of a man who should still have been walking. It was as if the earth itself had inhaled and swallowed him whole. We brought in experts, geologists, tracking specialists, even a team that used ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. Their instruments returned clean readings, as if that patch of land had never been disturbed. One scientist suggested a sudden sinkhole, a vertical collapse into a hidden cavern. But I knew the terrain. There were no fissures here, no voids waiting beneath the soil. And even if there had been, where were his radio, his pack, his flashlight? Equipment doesn't simply vanish into nothing. Some of the older rangers avoided the subject entirely, crossing themselves when I asked about forest lights. They told stories passed down by Miwok elders, tales of wandering lights that mimic lanterns, calling travelers off the path never to return. Biologists offered another theory: bioluminescent fungi, ghostly foxfire flickering through the underbrush. But Daniel's voice that night hadn't sounded like a man watching fungus glow. It had sounded like awe tinged with fear, and awe is reserved for things that move. On the 17th day, I returned alone to the ridge. It was near dusk, the light thinning into bruised violet when I saw it too. At first, just a faint pulse between the trunks, soft, golden, deliberate. Then another and another, drifting horizontally, far too smooth for fireflies. My chest tightened as they weaved through the trees in slow, purposeful arcs. Against my better judgment, I followed. Every instinct screamed to stop, but curiosity held me like gravity. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, as though each step drew me out of the world I knew and into one that was watching. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights vanished. I stood in darkness, alone and breathless, and when I checked my GPS, I felt my stomach drop. I was nearly 2 miles from where I'd started, with no memory of the detour. The path I'd taken didn't exist on any map. I never saw Daniel again. Officially, the case remains unsolved, filed away with dozens of other disappearances across the park's history. Some nights, I try to accept the explanations. Human error, disorientation, the indifferent cruelty of nature. But then I remember the tone of his voice. They're moving. And I wonder if the forest is indifferent at all. I still patrol that ridge. Same boots, same path, same quiet that presses against your skin like a held breath. And sometimes when the moon is high and the mist curls low around the pines, I hear it, the soft crunch of footsteps beside me, matching my pace. I never look. I never call out, because some part of me already knows that if I do, I might not come back either. Every night since Daniel vanished, I walk that same trail alone, and in the silence, something walks with me. They called it the Screaming Canyon, a narrow, hidden throat of red sandstone deep within Zion National Park where, after sunset, the wind was said to wail like a living thing. Most dismissed it as legend, the kind of story park rangers tell tourists to keep them on the trails. But legends have gravity, and as a graduate student in geophysics, I was drawn to them like a moth to a flickering bulb. Our professor, Dr. Reeves, believed the phenomenon could be explained by acoustics, shifting air pressure, stone curvature, maybe even resonance caused by thermal changes at night. I believed that too, at least at first. We were a team of 5 that summer, young, hungry, too confident for our own good. I remember the canyon's entrance vividly, a slit in the earth's crust so narrow we had to shuffle sideways, sandstone walls scraping against our packs. Above, the sky burned orange and violet, but inside, the light was swallowed by stone. It smelled of minerals and something older, like rain on ancient dust. Every sound we made, from boots crunching gravel to nervous laughter, came back warped and hollow. The canyon didn't just echo, it breathed. By dusk, we'd set up our instruments, pressure sensors, parabolic mics, spectral analyzers. The first gust rolled through at 8:13 p.m., a low, groaning rush that spiraled down the passage like a sigh through a bone flute. We grinned, exhilarated. This was textbook Aeolian resonance, wind sculpting sound against rock. But then the tone shifted. It dipped, wavered, and rose again in a slow, rising arc that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the randomness of wind, it was deliberate, patterned. Dr. Reeves replayed the recordings. That frequency curve, it's structured, he murmured. Layered even, layered. The word clung to me. There were undertones buried in the howl, deep and rhythmic, almost like breath. Then, faint but undeniable, came something else, a tremor of sound riding the lowest wave. It wasn't a moan, not exactly. It was closer to a vowel, a fragment of something human. We argued about it by the light of our camp lanterns. Maria swore it was pareidolia, our brains imposing patterns on chaos. Tom said it was geological, wind tunneling through cavities like an organ pipe. But when midnight fell and the canyon screamed again, none of us spoke. This time it was louder, closer, and threaded through the wail was a cadence too complex to be random. It rose and fell like language stripped of meaning, primal, pleading. I pressed my ear to the sandstone, and for a moment, I could swear I felt the sound vibrating through the rock, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. It was as if the canyon wasn't just carrying sound, it was making it. We followed the noise deeper the next day, tracing the twists of the canyon until it widened into a bowl-shaped hollow. There, carved into the walls, were symbols, spirals, jagged lines, and crude humanoid figures with mouths stretched impossibly wide. Bones littered the floor, sun-bleached and brittle. Some looked animal, some did not. That night, when the canyon began to scream again, it no longer sounded like mere wind. It sounded like something calling to us, and for reasons none of us could explain, we listened. We stayed longer than we should have, hypnotized by that sound. It wasn't just noise anymore, it had rhythm, intent, like a forgotten language buried in stone, struggling to be heard. Dr. Reeves insisted on setting up a second array deeper inside the canyon to triangulate the source. Maria argued we should leave, that the carvings and bones were reason enough to turn back. But Tom and I sided with Reeves. Curiosity has a way of overriding fear. It seeps into your decisions like water through sandstone, reshaping them without you noticing. The next night, we placed sensors near the hollow's center and waited. The wind rose earlier than before, curling down the canyon in a sound that was less a scream and more a lament. The frequency graph on Reeves's laptop spiked, forming repeating peaks, a structured pattern. "It's repeating every 42 seconds, he whispered, excitement eclipsing caution. But the thrill curdled in my stomach, because patterns implied purpose, and purpose meant something behind the sound. At 1:07 a.m., the scream shifted again. It fractured into overlapping layers, some impossibly low, others high enough to sting the ears. Then, woven through it, came a sound so subtle we almost missed it. A single, drawn-out note that rose and fell like a voice breathing. Maria's face drained of color. "That's not wind," she said. None of us disagreed. Tom moved closer to the canyon wall, his headlamp skimming over the carvings. He traced one figure's gaping mouth with trembling fingers. "These weren't warnings," he muttered. "They were invitations." His words barely left his lips before the sound changed again. Louder now, closer, as if the canyon itself had inhaled. And then, piercing through the layered moans, came a scream so human, so raw, it sliced the night open. We spun around. Tom was gone, his gear still lay by the wall. His headlamp flickered on the ground, casting frantic shadows. But there were no footprints, no drag marks, just empty space where he had been. Maria screamed his name into the canyon's throat, but her voice dissolved into the chorus rising around us. I shouted too, though part of me knew it was useless. If the canyon could erase a man without a trace, what chance did our voices have? We tore through the narrow passages until dawn, calling, searching, sobbing, nothing, just silence where sound had once lived. When the sun finally rose, it painted the sandstone a soft, innocent gold, as if the night before had never happened. Reeves filed the report as a tragic accident, a fall into an unseen crevasse. But I walked every inch of that place again and again. There was no crevasse, no fall, just absence, vast and deliberate. Weeks later, back at the lab, I listened to our recordings on repeat, chasing some hint of explanation. On the final night's file, at the 42-second mark, I heard the familiar layered wail. But beneath it, so faint I almost missed it, was something new. A voice, human, whispering a single word, my name. It came again, clearer this time, and not just my name. Maria's, Reeves's, even Tom's, spoken in the same cadence he used when he was alive. My breath caught as the canyon's scream rose around those names, no longer sounding like wind or pressure or geological chants. It sounded like memory, like the stone itself had learned our voices and was trying to speak them. Faded into silence. I understood something I hadn't before. Sound was never just sound here. It was a lure, and we had already answered. The final recording doesn't just capture the canyon's wail anymore, it speaks. And in the spaces between its screams, it calls each of our names. It was supposed to be a simple weekend. 3 days of camping by the still waters of Lake McDonald, a chance to breathe after months spent buried in city noise. Glacier National Park stretched around us like a cathedral of stone and sky, its jagged peaks mirrored perfectly in the lake's glassy surface. Even in summer, the water remained impossibly cold, fed by ancient ice melting somewhere high above. There was something sacred about it, something that made you lower your voice without realizing why, like a chapel carved by time itself. On our second evening, the air turned strange. The wind, which usually whispered through the pines, went still. The usual chorus of loons and insects fell silent, leaving only the rhythmic lap of water against the shore. My daughter pointed toward the far side of the lake. "Someone's there," she whispered. And she was right. A figure had emerged from the tree line, a man in a faded jacket, moving slowly, almost reverently, toward the water's edge. At first, I thought he was going to fish or wash something. But he didn't stop. He stepped into the water fully clothed, the icy surface swallowing his boots, then his knees, then his waist. Each step was deliberate, dreamlike, as if he were following a path only he could see. I shouted, but he didn't look back. His movements never faltered. The lake accepted him in silence, closing over his shoulders, then his head. And then nothing. No splash, no struggle, no ripple. Just empty water where a man had been. We called for help, of course. Rangers arrived within the hour, their radios crackling against the sudden quiet. They launched boats and dragged the lake with weighted lines, probing every inch of the water. Divers went down with lights piercing the blue gloom, but they found nothing. No body, no clothes, not even a boot print leading into the water. It was as if he had stepped from one world into another, and the lake had erased the evidence. That night, around the campfire, locals gathered to watch the searchlights sweep across the water. One of them, an older man with hands like twisted roots, shook his head when I described what I'd seen. "You saw the Mirror Lake take someone," he said. "It happens every few decades. Always the same way. They walk in, and they don't come back." I asked him what that meant, but he only stared at the water, as though the answer was floating just beneath its surface. Scientists later suggested shifting sediments might have created an underwater current strong enough to pull a person under. Others spoke of thermal vents or hidden fissures in the lake bed. But none of that explained the missing footprints. None of it explained the way he walked, as if called. And in the back of my mind, another thought began to bloom, dark and impossible to ignore. What if the lake wasn't just water? What if it was something older? Something that didn't just reflect the world above it, but remembered another one beneath. In the days that followed, the park transformed. What had once felt serene now carried a quiet tension, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The search continued, expanding far beyond the lake's edge. Helicopters scanned from above, sonar probed the depths, even cadaver dogs were brought in. Yet the result was always the same, nothing. The official line settled into something clinical and unsatisfying, accidental drowning, body unrecovered. But none of us who had seen him walk into that water believed it. People who drown thrash. They fight. He hadn't even paused. I found myself drawn back to the shore every evening. The lake was a mirror again, as still and perfect as polished obsidian, reflecting the mountains and clouds with eerie precision. But the longer I stared, the less it looked like reflection, and more like a doorway. Sometimes, in the half-light just before dusk, I swore I saw movement beneath the surface. Not fish, not driftwood, shapes. Slow and deliberate, like figures walking on a distant floor. And each time a chill crept into my bones, the kind that feels older than fear. Locals shared more stories when I asked. A prospector in the 1920s who vanished the same way. A woman in 1964 who stepped into the lake during a thunderstorm and never resurfaced. Each tale different, yet always the same details. No footprints, no splash, no body. And always the same eerie description. They didn't stumble into the water. They walked into it, as if guided, as if invited. Dr. Laird, a hydrologist stationed in the park, tried to offer comfort in data. He explained how cold water can preserve a body indefinitely, how sediment flows might bury remains, how deep currents could move them far from where they entered. His explanations were reasonable, even elegant. But deep down, I felt they were missing something fundamental. You can explain a disappearance, but not a choice. And the man had chosen to walk in. On our last night at the campsite, I woke just before dawn and stepped outside the tent. The air was sharp and cold, and the lake stretched before me in absolute stillness. Then, somewhere across the water, a ripple spread outward as if something had broken the surface and sunk again. My breath caught. It was small, subtle, but real. And then I saw it. A faint silhouette beneath the water, upright, moving forward with steady, unhurried steps. It wasn't possible. Yet there it was, the outline of a man, walking deeper and deeper into the blue. I wanted to call out, but the sound died in my throat. Maybe it was the same man. Maybe it was someone else. Or maybe the lake was showing me a reflection of what it had taken, a glimpse of where the missing go. But as I watched, the figure drifted farther into the distance until it was swallowed by darkness. We packed up that morning and left, but part of me never did. I still dream of that lake, black and endless, stretching beyond the reach of light. And in those dreams, the man is always there, walking without pause, deeper and deeper into that silent world beneath the surface. Some part of me knows he's still walking, not lost. Not gone, but moving through something older and stranger than water, in a place where time itself forgets to pass. They told me not to stay past sunset. Every ranger I met that summer said the same thing with the same uneasy glance toward the pines. Cabin 23 isn't meant to be watched. But I'd always prided myself on being the kind of man who didn't flinch at ghost stories. Yellowstone is full of them. Campfire tales about vanishings. Whispers of things older than the park itself. I thought this would be no different. I was wrong. Cabin 23 stood at the edge of a forgotten trail, a weathered skeleton of logs and moss perched beneath towering lodgepole pines. It had been a fire watch station decades ago, abandoned after a ranger vanished without explanation. Now, my assignment was simple. Spend 3 nights logging wildlife activity in the area before the cabin was sealed for good. It felt like a formality, a box to check. On the first evening, I walked its creaking floors with a flashlight, brushing dust from furniture that hadn't been touched in years. The air smelled of pine resin and rusted nails. It was lonely, but not frightening. The second night changed everything. It began with a sound, faint at first, like the rapping of woodpeckers somewhere deep in the trees. I noted it absently in my log, but the tapping grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the cabin walls. My pulse spiked. I checked every door and window. All were locked. The room was empty, yet the knocking persisted, slow and rhythmic, like someone rapping their knuckles against the inside of a coffin. I told myself it was the wind. Old wood contracts and shifts as temperatures drop. But I'd spent enough nights in ranger stations to know the difference between settling timber and deliberate sound. Still, I forced myself back to my desk and wrote another entry in my log, words that looked steadier on the page than I felt. Unexplained interior noise, approximate 2147, investigated, no source found. By midnight, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It felt heavy, as if the cabin were holding its breath with me. Sleep never came. I sat upright until dawn, watching the door like it might open on its own. Morning brought sunlight and embarrassment. The forest outside was alive with normal sounds again. Chickadees, distant elk calls, the wind combing through the pines. The night felt like a trick of the mind, a hallucination born from isolation. But that confidence began to fray as dusk bled into the third night. The knocking returned, louder this time, urgent, angry, then it became pounding, fists slamming against wood from nowhere. rattling the windows, shaking the table where my logbook lay open, my heart hammered with it, each thud syncing with my pulse. I shouted into the emptiness, demanded it stop, but the pounding only grew faster, closer, and then, through the vent above my head, I heard it. A whisper. Too soft to understand, but unmistakably human. That was the moment I realized cabin 23 wasn't empty. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon my assignment and never look back. But something in that whisper held me in place. Not just fear, but a strange pull like a hook beneath the skin. It came again, faint and shivering, threading through the vent like breath itself. I strained to catch a word, a syllable, anything. And then I heard it, my name, drawn out in a rasping voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I backed away from the wall, my flashlight jittering across the room. The pounding had stopped as suddenly as it began. The silence was deeper now, as if the entire forest beyond the cabin had gone still to listen. My breath fogged in the air. The temperature had dropped without warning, cold enough that frost began to spiderweb across the window glass. I turned toward the door, half ready to bolt into the night, when I noticed something new. Footprints, a second set pressed clearly into the dust across the cabin floor. Bare feet, small, delicate. They trailed from the back wall toward the center of the room, stopping just a few feet from where I stood. My pulse roared in my ears. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, and yet someone, or something, had been walking beside me all along. I remember writing in the log then, my hands shaking so badly the words were barely legible. Voices through vent. Temperature drop. Unexplained prints. Do not feel alone. After that, the entries grow frantic, fragmented. My memory does too. Somewhere around 2 a.m., the pounding returned. Not from the walls this time, but from beneath the floorboards. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. 3 heavy blows, a pause, then 3 again. Dust rained from the ceiling. My lantern flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. And then the whisper was everywhere. Not one voice, but many, layered and overlapping, as if the walls themselves were speaking. I stumbled back against the door, fumbling with the lock, desperate to get out. But the handle wouldn't budge. It was as though the wood had swollen around it, sealing me inside. My own heartbeat thundered in my skull, matching the rhythm below. And then the voices fell silent, all at once, replaced by a single sound that froze me where I stood. Footsteps, slow, measured, coming closer. I don't remember opening the door. I don't remember stepping outside. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the clearing beyond the cabin, barefoot, the icy ground biting into my skin. The forest around me was silent again. The cabin stood behind me, door ajar, lantern light still swaying inside. But there were 2 sets of footprints in the snow now, mine and another set leading into the trees. I never saw what walked beside me that night. Maybe I was never meant to. But when investigators arrived days later, they found cabin 23 just as I'd left it. Door open, logbook unfinished. One final line trailing off mid-sentence. They sealed cabin 23 soon after, boarding its windows and barring its doors. But hikers still say that on cold, windless nights, if you stop and listen near the clearing, you'll hear it too, the knocking, soft and patient, from somewhere deep within the walls. Cartography is supposed to be the most precise science in the wilderness. Every contour line, every bend in a river, every tree line captured on a map is a promise that the land is what it claims to be. That's why Denali had always fascinated me. Its vastness demanded honesty, and maps were my language of truth. Or so I believed, until the summer I discovered that the land itself was lying. It started with a routine survey. I'd been contracted by the Park Service to update trail systems and verify coordinates ahead of the next season's visitor guide. The work was straightforward. Log GPS data, update topographic features, and cross-check with historical maps. My first week passed without incident, but on the 8th day, as I traced an old miner's road marked on a 1930s map, something strange happened. The trail was exactly where the archive claimed it would be, rutted and narrow, swallowed in places by moss, except it wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It had been abandoned and erased from official records decades ago. I chalked it up to an oversight. Historical trails sometimes linger longer than they should. But when I followed it deeper into the forest, my compass began to misbehave. The needle twitched wildly, spinning without reason even when I stood still. My GPS unit, usually so precise it could pinpoint a single tree, began to glitch, its display fragmenting into static. When it cleared, the coordinates no longer matched my location. According to the satellite, I was standing on a paved road, one that hadn't existed here in nearly a century. I pressed on, curiosity outweighing caution. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. Trails forked into places no satellite imagery showed. Clearings appeared and vanished between blinks, as if the forest itself were rewriting its layout. At one point, I reached a ridge where a landmark, a small glacial pond I'd logged earlier, was simply gone, replaced by a meadow of wildflowers. It felt like walking through a book whose pages were rearranging themselves while I read. By the second week, my data logs looked less like survey notes and more like hallucinations. Duplicate entries appeared where none should be. Distances refused to add up. Landmarks listed on multiple maps failed to exist in the real world, while features no record had ever mentioned stood solid before me. I began cross-referencing with historical charts, desperate to anchor myself to something real. That's when the patterns emerged. Old trails, long-vanished outposts, and mining roads all clustered around the same grid squares. Places that should have been lost to time seemed to bleed faintly back into existence. I told myself it was tectonic shift, magnetic interference, perhaps even a glitch in the satellite data. But deep down, a question gnawed at me. What if the maps weren't wrong? What if time itself was thinner here than we thought? Thin enough for the past to press its fingerprints against the present. And then, one overcast afternoon, I saw smoke. A thin, wavering column rising from the valley floor where, according to every map in existence, there was nothing at all. I should have reported the anomaly and left it for someone else to investigate. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But the sight of that smoke, pale and steady against the bruised sky, drew me like a lodestar. It wasn't just evidence. It was an invitation. I descended the ridge, pushing through alder and spruce, the underbrush clawing at my clothes as the air grew colder and stiller. The forest here felt different, as if it were holding its breath, as if every tree were leaning inward to watch. The trail I followed was too deliberate to be an animal path. It dipped and curved with human intention, lined by stones so old they were half swallowed by moss. My instruments continued their rebellion. The compass spun lazily, and the GPS insisted I was standing in open tundra. Yet there, between the trees, buildings began to appear. First just silhouettes, then clearer shapes. Wooden structures with steep gabled roofs, fences of hand-hewn logs, a bell tower rising from the center of what looked like a small town square. I froze at the tree line, heart pounding. None of this was supposed to be here. No records, no aerial surveys, no historical documents mentioned a settlement in this valley. And yet here it was, alive. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Chickens clucked in a pen, and on a porch, a woman in a gingham dress rocked slowly in a chair, knitting beneath the pale afternoon light. I stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel that shouldn't exist. She looked up and smiled as though I were expected. "Long way from the station, aren't you?" she said. Her voice carried no surprise, no suspicion, only the casual familiarity of someone greeting a neighbor. I asked where I was, half expecting her to name a research outpost or historical replica. Instead, she said, "Welcome to Clearwater, population 73 last I counted." "And you're just in time. Winter's coming early this year. Clearwater." I searched my memory. Nothing. I asked the year. She frowned as if I were joking. 1938, she said matter-of-factly, and went back to her knitting. For what felt like hours, I wandered that town. The people wore clothes decades out of time, spoke of Roosevelt as if he were still president, and traded goods like a frontier settlement untouched by modernity. Yet none of them questioned me. My clothes, my equipment, even my questions were met with polite indifference, as though I belonged. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, Clearwater was gone. One blink, one distracted glance at my malfunctioning GPS, and the town had dissolved into forest and fog. The bell tower, the porches, the people, all vanished. Only the faint smell of wood smoke lingered on the air. as if mocking the emptiness around me. I stumbled back to camp shaken and silent. Days later, reviewing the photos from my survey, I felt my breath catch. Most were blank, empty landscapes, nothing but trees and sky. But one image was different. In it stood a weathered wooden sign at the edge of a road, carved with a single word, Clearwater. And beneath it, the date, September 14th, 1938. I took that photo yesterday. The map wasn't wrong. It was incomplete, and somewhere beneath the skin of Denali, time folds over itself, carrying pieces of 1938 into the present, waiting for some frostbitten fingers, fractured ankles, the usual accidents that come from underestimating the wilderness. But nothing prepared me for the three who walked out of Olympic National Park that summer. They'd vanished for 7 days without food, water, or shelter. Search and rescue had combed hundreds of miles of dense forest, convinced we were looking for bodies. Then, just as suddenly as they disappeared, they reappeared, strolling out of the tree line near Lake Crescent, calm as if they'd only been gone for a few hours. They were dehydrated, but unharmed. Their clothes were intact, their boots barely scuffed. But the strangest part was their watches. All three had stopped, frozen at exactly 2:17 p.m., the same time they'd entered the woods a week earlier. And when I asked where they'd been, their answers were identical. "We just took a short hike," one said. "We were gone maybe 2 hours." The others nodded, confused by the question. Their sense of time, of reality itself, seemed suspended. At first, I thought trauma was to blame. The mind can fracture under extreme stress, distorting memory as a form of protection. But there was something else, something harder to name. Their speech carried an odd cadence, halting in ways that felt rehearsed, as if they were mimicking the rhythm of conversation rather than participating in it. They blinked less often than most people, their eyes lingering too long on whatever they looked at, including me. And then there were the things they knew. One of them, a man named Eric, asked me about a landslide that had closed a nearby road. It had happened 3 hours earlier. He had no phone, no radio, no way of knowing. Another Mara mentioned the name of a patient I'd seen that morning, someone she couldn't possibly have heard about. It was like they had slipped out of the forest carrying fragments of knowledge they shouldn't possess. The media swarmed, of course. Scientists speculated about fugue states and collective amnesia. A neurologist suggested transient global amnesia triggered by shared trauma, but locals whispered a different story, one older and harder to dismiss. "They're not them," one ranger muttered when he thought I wasn't listening. "They look like them, but they're not." I told myself that was nonsense. And yet, the more time I spent with them, the more I noticed how deeply they avoided sunlight, choosing to sit in dim corners of the clinic even on clear days. How they spoke of the forest with a kind of reverence, describing it not as a place but as a presence. "It's not what you think it is," Eric told me once, his voice low and distant. "It's older. And it remembers." Something about that unsettled me more than I cared to admit, because when I closed the clinic at night and walked past the dark tree line beyond town, I felt it too, a gaze I couldn't see but couldn't ignore, following me all the way home. And I began to wonder, when the forest gives someone back, does it ever truly let them go? I kept them for observation longer than protocol allowed, calling it caution when it was fixation. Blood work ordinary, scans clean. Yet the EEGs troubled me. Slow waves while they were awake, as if their minds idled in a dark garage. In daylight they winced, pupils pinning then blooming. They asked to go inside. I agreed, though the request felt like gravity tugging us to shade. We tried a group session. I asked for the moment the trail slipped from under them. Their voices braided, finishing one another's phrases with eerie precision, like instruments tuned to one pitch. Every few minutes their cadence stalled, as if something buffered, then resumed. I played birdsong from the grove where they vanished. All three turned toward the speaker in the same slow arc. "Home," Mara breathed, and the word moved across my skin like a cold stone. Anxious habits multiplied. I checked the clinic locks twice, then 3 times. Nights I watched the black band of trees beyond the streetlights. Then came smaller changes, salt and metal in every taste, dreams thinning like wet paper, sunlight needling behind my eyes. Worst was the timing. I began waking at 2:17 a.m., the same frozen minute stamped on their watches. "Suggestion," I insisted. "Echo, not omen." But what I didn't expect was how information arrived early. The phone vibrated in my palm before it rang. I answered questions patients hadn't asked. I wore sunglasses indoors. Fluorescence felt like snow glare. During rounds, Eric paused by the window and looked at the trees with the tenderness reserved for a sleeping animal. Something old stirred under my ribs, like a tide finding its moon. A week later, he met me behind the clinic where dumpsters breathe sour heat. Fog slid between cedars like silk over glass. "We brought something back," he said, eyes on the tree line, and the words dropped through me like a coin into cold water. For a heartbeat, his face looked double, two exposures trying to fuse. "It doesn't like the city," he added. "It prefers rooms without windows." That night I lay on the couch, the house humming like a transformer. At 2:17, a soft tapping crossed the ceiling, then moved down the hall, as though fingertips learned the shape of my home. The tapping reached the front door and stopped. In the silence, the refrigerator clicked, the clock whispered, and outside the trees leaned like conspirators. A thought opened like a trap door. What if the forest wasn't outside anymore? What if the boundary had followed them in, thin as breath? I woke on cold earth with cedar duff in my mouth. Gray dawn threaded a high canopy. Rain beaded leaves like quicksilver. My hands were scratched, shoes caked with mud. I stood in a place with no road, no trail, and no memory of leaving home. A crow called once and again, a metronome in an empty church. I checked my watch. 2:17, the second hand wouldn't move. I turned in a slow circle, every nerve strung like wire. Maybe I had come. Maybe I had been brought. Either way, the forest matched my cadence, a careful dancer learning my breath. Somewhere close, a branch released its water with a quiet sigh. I took one step, then another. When the forest gives someone back, it keeps a map. I came to Sequoia to study how trees talk to each other. It sounds poetic, but it's real science. A web of roots and fungal threads pulsing with chemical signals, carrying warnings, nutrients, even memory between pines miles apart. For years, I'd traced those signals with sensors and spectrometers, turning whispers of the forest into data points. But last autumn, buried in the quiet heart of the park, I recorded something that didn't fit any model. It started as a faint pulse on my instruments, too regular to be random, too structured to be background noise. It wasn't the chemical chatter I'd mapped before. It was rhythmic, intentional. A steady thrum every 19 seconds, layered with smaller oscillations like the beats of a hidden heart. My first instinct was equipment failure. I recalibrated everything twice. Same result. The signal persisted. Over the next week, I triangulated the source to a secluded basin deep in the grove, a place locals called Whisper Hollow. It was an old growth stand, colossal sequoias towering like cathedrals, their bark furrowed like ancient scrolls. The air there felt thicker, heavy with resin and something harder to define, like the weight of being watched. My instruments grew erratic as I approached. The signal's strength spiked and dipped unpredictably, sometimes vanishing entirely only to surge back stronger than before. My compass spun lazily. Even the temperature fluctuated by several degrees without warning. On the fourth day, the pulse changed. It wasn't a clean rhythm anymore. It had become more complex, layered with subtle modulations. It reminded me of Morse code, but far too intricate, as though the forest itself was thinking through sound. I placed a microphone among the roots, and that's when I heard it with my own ears. A low hum threading through the canopy, rising and falling with uncanny precision. It wasn't wind. It wasn't insects. It was deliberate. I logged everything carefully, determined to stay objective. But as the days passed, that hum began to feel personal. When I entered the grove, the signal shifted, slowing when I stopped, quickening as I moved, as though responding to me. Once, as I stood completely still, the hum paused altogether. The silence was so profound I could hear my heartbeat echoing against the bark. Then softly the sound resumed, slower now, gentler, almost curious. I told myself I was anthropomorphizing, projecting intention where there was none. But deep down, a thought rooted itself and refused to die. What if it wasn't just a signal? What if it was a voice? On the seventh night, just before dusk, the hum rose into something new, a series of tonal shifts that brushed the edge of language. I leaned closer to the recorder, breath shallow. Beneath the hum was a texture I hadn't noticed before. Faint, breath-like whispers threading between the frequencies. Too soft to decipher, but too human to ignore. And then, as the last light drained from the grove, the hum stopped entirely. In the silence that followed, the forest held itself perfectly still. That was when I heard it, clear as a word spoken just behind my ear. A single deliberate sound that didn't belong to wind or root or branch. The words, if it was a word, replayed over and over in my head, too deliberate to be dismissed, too alien to translate. I combed through the recording again and again, isolating frequencies, slowing them down, stretching the sound until it fractured into smaller shapes. What emerged wasn't random. It had cadence, pattern, syntax, the faint skeleton of language. But language built by what? By morning, I knew I had to go back. Rationality told me to bring colleagues, more instruments, more eyes. But some deeper instinct, a primal, inexplicable pull, told me I needed to go alone. So I did. I hiked into Whisper Hollow at dawn, mist still clinging to the ground like spilled breath. The trees loomed higher than I remembered, their trunks vanishing into low clouds, their canopy woven into a living ceiling that blocked the sun. The air smelled different too, sharper, metallic, charged like the air before a storm. The signal returned as soon as I crossed the boundary of the grove. It was weaker this time, like a voice just out of earshot, but it was there, pulsing with the same 19-second rhythm. And just as before, it changed when I moved. Slower when I paused, quicker when I stepped forward. It wasn't just reacting, it was tracking me. Halfway through the grove, my equipment died. One by one, screens blinked black. Batteries that had been full minutes earlier were now dead weight. Even my watch froze, its second hand twitching uselessly. I stood there in the thick, humming silence, stripped of all the tools I trusted. And that's when the whispering began again. It came not from a single direction, but from everywhere. Above, below, within the trees themselves. It wasn't language I recognized, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of communication. Something was speaking. And impossibly, I felt that it was speaking to me. The hairs on my arms stood up as the whispers folded into something rhythmic and haunting. A pattern too deliberate to be random, too organic to be human. Then the grove moved, not in any way that could be captured on a camera or explained in a paper, but in a way that bypassed sight entirely. The space itself seemed to stretch and contract, as if the forest were breathing. The trees felt closer, their massive trunks curving inward like a living wall. My chest tightened. I stumbled backward, but there was no clear path anymore. The grove had rearranged itself into a labyrinth of roots and shadow. I don't remember leaving. My next memory is of standing on the trail hours later, the grove far behind me, my recorder clutched tight in my shaking hands. I don't know how I got there, and I don't know how long I was gone. My watch still read 2:17. Weeks have passed since then. The Park Service claims the grove doesn't exist. I returned with a team, but where the trees once stood was now empty meadow. No signal, no whom, no trace. But every night since, at exactly 2:17 a.m., my recorder wakes itself. And in the dark, alone in my lab, I hear the grove again. The pulse, the whisper, the almost words. Louder now, closer. The trees may be gone, but they haven't stopped speaking. And I can't shake the feeling that next time, they won't be calling from the forest. They'll be calling from here. They called it the trail that doesn't exist. A narrow dirt path that appears only on certain mist-heavy mornings in Grand Teton National Park. Winding away from the main route like a thread unraveling from the fabric of the earth. I used to laugh at those stories when I was still a ranger. Fog plays tricks on the eyes, I'd say. Light bends, memory falters, but retirement has a way of loosening your grip on certainty. And after 3 disappearances in one season, all in the same valley, I decided to see for myself if the stories were more than myth. The morning I returned to the park, the air was thick with low-lying fog that blurred the horizon into watercolor. It was the kind of weather old-timers swore revealed the trail. I hiked for hours along the familiar ridgeline, boots crunching on frost-bitten ground, until the world shifted in a way I can't quite explain. The main trail curved left as it always had, but now, to the right, another path branched off. Faint but unmistakable, etched into the soil as if it had always been there. My heart thudded once, hard. I knew I should turn back. I'd spent decades warning others not to chase shadows. But the pull was irresistible. The path seemed to breathe beneath the mist, inviting and patient. I stepped onto it. From the first step, everything felt wrong. The air grew unnaturally still, the usual forest chorus muted to silence. Even the ground felt different beneath my boots. Softer, almost hollow, like walking across the skin of something vast and sleeping. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. The trees around me stretched impossibly tall, their trunks twisting into shapes no wind could carve. Shadows moved where nothing should move. At times, I felt certain I was walking in circles, yet the trail never doubled back. And then the forest ended. The path opened into a valley I had never seen before, and I knew every inch of this park. The land here was carved by forces I couldn't name. Towering stone arches rising hundreds of feet high, their surfaces etched with patterns that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The sky glowed with a color that didn't exist in nature, a pale, shifting hue that seemed alive. And the silence, it wasn't just absence of sound, it was presence. It pressed against my chest, filling my lungs with something heavier than air. I took out my journal, old habit, and scribbled every detail, my hands trembling as I wrote. I tried to mark the trail behind me, but when I turned, it was gone. Only endless stone stretched back into the haze. Panic flickered in the edges of my mind. I told myself I'd retrace my steps, but I had the sinking feeling that steps meant nothing here. Then, somewhere beyond the arches, something moved. It was too far to see clearly, just a ripple of light and shadow shifting against the impossible sky. But I knew, with the same certainty that had guided me into these wilds my whole life, that I was not alone. For a long time, I didn't move. Whatever was out there, whatever stirred beyond those monolithic arches, felt vast and deliberate, like a tide shifting in deep water. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but back was gone. The trail had vanished, swallowed by the same impossible geometry that now surrounded me. So I did the only thing I could. I walked forward. The air thickened as I moved, each breath heavier than the last. The silence pressed closer too, not empty but watchful, like a held breath waiting for something to happen. As I passed beneath the first arch, the stone hummed beneath my fingertips, a low, resonant vibration that sank straight into my bones. It wasn't random. It pulsed in intervals, almost like a heartbeat, or a message. Beyond the arches, the landscape shifted again. What I had taken for stone structures now looked more like ruins, colossal fragments of something once built, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when I looked too long. Light slanted oddly here, bending around corners it shouldn't, casting shadows that moved against their sources. My compass spun uselessly, and my watch froze at 2:17. I laughed, though the sound came out thin and cracked. Time had stopped paying attention. I wrote furiously in my journal, describing every anomaly, every detail that might later anchor this experience to reality. But the deeper I ventured, the more reality frayed. The ground beneath me shifted subtly with each step, as if the land itself were breathing. Once, when I glanced behind me, the arches had rearranged into new configurations, their forms different than before. It was like walking through a dream that refused to stay still. Then I saw the figure. It stood at the far end of a rise, too distant to make out clearly, but I knew immediately it wasn't human. Its proportions were off, too elongated, too still. It didn't walk so much as glide, drifting soundlessly across the strange terrain, and though it was impossibly far away, I felt its gaze snap to me. My pulse stuttered. The silence grew heavier, almost deafening now, and in that unbearable quiet, a thought surfaced unbidden. This is not a place. It's a threshold. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, hours, days. The figure vanished into the haze, and the arches pulsed brighter, their patterns rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I tried to follow my steps back, but the path dissolved beneath me, replaced by terrain I didn't recognize. My words in the journal grew frantic, looping over themselves as fear finally broke through reason. And then, nothing. That's where the memory ends. The rest of my journal is blank, except for one final line scrawled crookedly near the bottom of the page. It's not ahead of us. It's beneath. I don't remember writing it. Months later, hikers found my journal resting on a boulder deep in the backcountry. a place no trail leads to, marked by no map. But the strangest part wasn't where they found it. It was the date inked on the final page, October 14th, 2035. I disappeared in 2025. The trail never returned. But somewhere beyond the arches, something else is still moving. And it's us walking the wild edges of America. Patrolling trails no one remembers, searching for hikers who never come back, and cataloging anomalies that no official report dares to name. I've seen people vanish 10 feet from their campsites, footprints that stop mid-stride, fires that burn cold, and trees that rearrange themselves overnight. Over the years, I told myself these were separate mysteries, accidents, coincidences, tragedies carved from the chaos of nature. But patterns have a way of surfacing when you've been watching long enough. And the longer I looked, the harder it became to believe that the land was just land. The first case that unsettled me happened in 1989. A boy disappeared near a stream in Shenandoah. Search teams swept a 5-mile radius for days. On the 4th day, we found his backpack perched neatly on a boulder beside the water, dry, spotless, like it had been placed there minutes earlier. No footprints surrounded it, not even our own. We followed the stream downstream for another mile and found nothing but a single tree bent into the shape of an arch, as though beckoning someone through. Then came the others. A woman who vanished near Crater Lake was found 6 years later, barefoot, dazed, wearing the same clothes she'd disappeared in. She hadn't aged a day. A climber in Yellowstone vanished mid-ascent. His rope ended abruptly against bare rock, as if the rest of him had been erased. And scattered across dozens of incidents were stranger details. Moss growing in perfect rings where people vanished. Stones stacked in deliberate spirals. Trees scorched without fire. At first, I clung to science, microclimates, magnetic anomalies, predators dragging bodies away. But each explanation unraveled as quickly as I built it. How does moss grow in a perfect circle overnight? How does a healthy adult vanish without a single sound or struggle? How does someone lose 6 years and come back unchanged? It wasn't until I retired that I started connecting the threads. I spread decades of case files across my kitchen table, marking maps with pins, drawing lines between incidents. That's when I saw it. Disappearances weren't random. They followed the land, rivers, ridges, ley lines, tree clusters, like points on a living body. It wasn't chaos. It was design. The realization sank into me like cold water. We've always treated wilderness as passive, something to conquer, to preserve, to catalog. But what if it isn't passive at all? What if the forests, the rivers, the mountains are not just landscapes, but living systems with intentions older than memory? Not gods, not spirits, something deeper, something that remembers. I thought of the stories old rangers used to tell around campfires. How the land chooses who stays and who returns. How the trees remember names whispered into their bark. I used to laugh at them. But now, with patterns etched across decades, I wasn't laughing. Something in the land was awake. And the question that haunted me wasn't what had happened to the vanished, but why them and not us? I returned to the parks with no badge, only a notebook and a map stitched with red thread. Wardens carried stories. Scientists carried new instruments. Data glittered like fish scales, beautiful, partial, never the whole animal. Every talk curved to the same admission. We can measure trees, not intentions. Yet intention felt like current underfoot. The more I listened, the more the land answered in patterns. In Yosemite, a wind recording repeated every 42 seconds. In Zion, a spectrum rose like a ribcage. In the Smokies, light pooled like mercury and trails turned like dogs circling beds. Nothing proved intelligence, but each detail leaned toward a hidden magnet. What were we missing, signal or humility? I left offerings the way my grandmother did, a palm of salt, a coin, a name into bark. It felt foolish, then humbling, then necessary. I apologized when I stepped over deadfall, thanked creeks when they let me pass, and kept my palm on granite until my pulse matched the mountain's rumor. If I anthropomorphized the land, it anthropomorphized me back. Patterns sharpened. Sites of vanishings aligned with faults and mycorrhizal hubs, as if Earth rewrote itself at seams while forests carried the edits. A botanist in Sequoia said roots traffic in memory like libraries. A physicist in Denali said time thins where energy's not. Different languages, same thesis. The wild heart beat underfoot, coded like a forgotten map. If the land chooses, what is it choosing for? I thought of the unaged, watches arrested at 1 minute, trails that appear only under weather like a held breath. Not punishments, maybe invitations. Not predators, thresholds. A trial, a census? The idea felt outrageous, then ordinary. A living system samples its world. A memory tests what it remembers. What would it want from us? On my last patrol, a courtesy loop from a superintendent, I set out before dawn, a fading lantern on the seam between trail and rumor. I carried no weapon, only water, first aid, notebook, radio. Ridge mist lay like a shawl. Frost flashed on sedges like glass. As the sun found pines, the hush deepened, the auditorium quiet before the curtain lifts. Something listened. I visited the boards where I once posted notices, thumbtacks biting cork like teeth. I read the names I remember and those I cannot forget. Then I did the only honest thing left. I spoke to the woods, what I had learned, what I fear, that I would leave if asked, stay if wished. A jay stitched one bright syllable through the hush. At twilight, I reached an overlook of 30 miles of fur and rumor. I set the radio on granite and clicked transmit, leaving the channel open. No speech, breath a machine could hold. The sky turned bruised blue. Coyotes threaded the valley and cut the thread. The first star appeared, steady as a vow. I spoke my name into the trees and waited. The recording is clean. I have played it in labs, kitchens, and motels. It never changes. Wind, faint leather scuff, television, snow, hush. Then a gap you feel more than hear, like the forest breathes with me. From that breath, a whisper forms at the edge of audibility, one fold shaping a word, my name. After it says me, the tape returns to the oldest sentence an old place knows. Silence, subscribe, if you dare.